Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight on our Google Hangout to talk about writing senior theses. We have some panelists with us, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to let you know that on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a bar where you can ask questions if you're logged in with your Google Plus account. So I encourage you to do that and join us to ask questions. You'll also be able to let us know which questions you'd like to have answered by clicking on the +1. And we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Yeah, so let's just start by allowing our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll begin with Chad.
Okay, I'm Chad Horner. I was an ORF major last year, and I wrote my thesis about the effect of airline mergers on airfares. And my findings were that basically, like, the consolidation of the industry over the last decade or so hasn't really caused fares to go up, like, abnormally in any way.
Great, thank you. Christine?
Hi, I'm Christy Young. I was an English major, and I wrote my thesis about representations of illness in Virginia Woolf's novels.
Okay, got it, Alex.
My name is Greta Shum, and I was a comparative literature major with a certificate in planets and life. So I wrote my thesis comparing the search for life on other planets to the process of writing a literary utopia.
Hi, I'm Alex Kadsden. I was an ecology and evolutionary biology major at Princeton, and I wrote my thesis on conservation attitudes, and if people who see penguins in the wild are more apt to change their attitudes towards conservation than people who see penguins in a captive experience in an aquarium. So I did field research over the summer in South Africa.
Great. Thank you all. We'll let some questions pile up here, but in the meantime, I was wondering if you might let us know what was the most important thing you did during the first, maybe even the first month of your thesis research.
I'll start, I guess. So for me, I think it really depends, obviously, on what type of thesis you're writing. But the thing that was most important to me was finding the data I was going to use. And I just happened to get like a good head start on that. And that I feel like that's one of, like, if you're writing some sort of analytical thesis, one of the things you'll be most worried about is like not having good data to work with. So trying to find that as soon as possible, I would say, is the thing I did.
I'll go next. I think the most important thing for me early on was meeting with my advisor, even when I wasn't really sure what I was doing yet, just to set expectations and get an idea for where I should be looking for more sources or what kind of thinking I should be doing, and also just setting up an outline for the year. I think that was an important step.
I'd have to agree with Christy on this one. For me, during the first month, it feels like there's a lot of things that you should be doing, and there's a huge timeline ahead of you. I think first off, meeting with your advisor and setting some reasonable expectations is a really, really helpful thing to do to just calm your nerves and think about the task as a very long-term and accomplishable thing that you'll do in small bits. But also doing research and taking notes on that research basically builds into just starting writing, and writing your thesis, however, first drafty or rough drafty might seem, is just so helpful in getting some momentum.
And this is going to sound very echoey at this point, but I think my situation was a little different than those who've already spoken, in that I had my September of senior year, I had my data because I did research over the summer. So in September of senior year, I essentially had to get less overwhelmed by all of my Excel spreadsheets. So I spent a lot of time just organizing my data and making it make sense, and also learning how to use R. And those were necessary precursors to being able to do anything with my data. And I have to agree with Greta that writing your thesis can seem really, really intimidating. So I figured out the things I could write without doing anything. And that was pretty much my introduction. So I knew why I was writing this thesis. I knew it was motivating it. I'd been thinking about that for a while because I had to know that in order to get funding to go to South Africa. So I was able to use a lot of the stuff I had already written and thought about and piece it together into a very rough version of my introduction I'm pretty sure not a lot of that ended up being in my thesis come April, but it felt really good to get words on a page, and it made it seem like I had 7 pages down.
Great. A couple of you mentioned developing a relationship with your advisor, and I wonder how if you could talk about how you developed that relationship. What was it like to learn how to work with your advisor? Do you have any suggestions for people who are just beginning this kind of relationship for the first time?
I would say with my advisor, I didn't necessarily think about my second. So in Comp Lit, you have both a primary advisor and a secondary advisor, and I right away started meeting with my primary advisor, with whom I had a seminar as well, so it was just natural for me to work with him. But I didn't really reach out to my secondary advisor, and it turned out that a lot of my friends in comparative literature built really strong relationships with their secondary advisor, and this will be relevant for working with just any professor, no matter what your department. I think you can really use the tools that are available to you throughout your department, and people often kind of complain about how their advisor doesn't, match their working skills or their real style, and that can be overcome by just reaching out to other people as well. So it's not just a relationship between a student and an advisor.
I think it's also really important to set expectations at the beginning. So having a conversation with your advisor and just being really frank about it of, so are we going to meet weekly? Are we going to meet monthly? Do you expect me to send you drafts periodically? Or are you just going to look at one thing all the way at the end? Because some of my friends had advisors that wanted to see something in writing every week. And then they'd look at multiple drafts, and they were essentially helping them very, very much in the writing of their thesis, and that they saw a lot of versions of it. My advisor told me from the beginning that he was going to look at it once, and he didn't care if that was in pieces or all at once at the end. But it was really great to know that at the beginning, that I wasn't expecting from the outset that he was going to be looking at it throughout the entire year, that I could say, okay, my goal is going to be to get him a draft 6 weeks before the deadline, so I can get comments 6 weeks before the deadline and have time to address those, and I know that I'm not going to get any more comments, so I don't have to worry about addressing secondary comments because I'm not going to get them. So it's just really good to know that that was what was going to happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, for my advisor, he was just very hands-off. It's like when I started writing, I was like, okay, maybe a lot of my friends would, like, they would send but they would go over, like, multiple drafts with their advisors. So I sent him, like, 20 pages or so, and it's like, what do you think? And he's like, I scanned it over, it looks pretty good, but, like, you don't need to send me things, I'll just read the final. So that was great to know, and it also made it less stressful for me. But yeah, it's just good to know those things, because every advisor is going to have different opinions.
And I also think it's early stages of your thesis, when maybe you don't have a lot of work to show your advisor yet, to just meet with them or email them and talk about other things. I think if you get to know them a little bit better and help them get to know you, who you are outside of your thesis and your other classes and your extracurriculars and what commitments you have outside, helps them understand you, and they can help navigate you through the year, and they'll be much more understanding if you have something else busy going on at one point, if you tell them about that ahead of time.
For example, I was president of the Hangout Club this year, and so I was very worried about anything substantial before November. So the show would take over my life. And it was fine, and I didn't do anything crazy substantial on my thesis until November, and it was okay. But he knew that I was fine with that. He came to see the show. And that really made him see that though I hadn't given him very much, he knew what I was spending my time on. And that was okay. And so he got to know me as a person, and he got to see me.
Great. We have a question that's been hanging out for a while, so let's go ahead and answer it if we can. For an experimental thesis, when is the latest safe time to have all of your results by, and how detrimental is it to have not entirely favorable results? And this could be from your own experience, from friends' experiences.
So my results were not favorable. They were completely contrary to our expectations, and I think it was because The reason nobody had asked my question before was because it was basically statistically impossible to ask that question. So it was really hard for me to write my thesis because the results I got were contrary to everything that we thought would happen, and despite doing a bunch of regressions, it was still probably completely biased. So, but that's okay. I was able to write something. I wrote 100 pages. It made sense, and I made some sort of argument, and I was able to discuss why we might not have gotten what we expected, and why it was really hard to answer this question, and why there was going to be all this bias, and what that bias was, and what it meant that there was bias, and that's okay. They understand that this is a one-year project. Normally, if you were doing some sort of research project like this, I would go out to the field, I would get data, it wouldn't work out exactly, and I would go back and I would ask different questions because I knew what kinds of questions worked and what didn't, and what I needed to do to refine my research question. And we can't do that here. So you get one shot at it, and if that shot doesn't work out perfectly, that's totally fine, as long as you're able to identify why it might not have worked perfectly, and if you were to do it again, how you would change it to make it better.
Anybody else have friends with this experience who were collecting some experimental data and then either plans changed or data didn't turn out as they thought it might?
Yeah, one of my roommates had that happen to him, and he had put a ton of work into everything, like all of his analysis. It just like his results didn't really show much. But like Alex said, I mean, they understand that. Like they're not. It's otherwise everyone's thesis doesn't prove something great. It's just not how it's gonna work. And they definitely, as long as you put in a lot of the work and explain why you didn't get the results you expected. It's just you can. It's not like you can't recover from that.
Great. A lot of people right now are thinking about applying for funding. There's a deadline coming up, and I was wondering if you might talk a bit about your experiences with applying for funding, whether you did that, what the process was like for you, how you used it.
Who among us got funding, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I have very little law over there.
Okay. So we can talk about funding.
Okay. I think we both had similar yet different experiences in funding. So I also did work over the summer before the process of writing actually started. But to be honest, I used very little of that. And so I think it's important to just remember that funding is like there, and they're wanting people to use it. So don't freak out too much about like being super rigid on everything. You should have like a basic itinerary, timetable, and it should be very interesting to you, and you're going to do this no matter what, and it may not end up in your thesis. So like, I guess the biggest message that I want to send is that you should use this opportunity of having a thesis to write to go do research somewhere else off campus. I don't know, that's a very specific question, and I think any off-campus research that you do that requires funding will be very specific to whatever you're doing, but I would just encourage you to do it if you have the opportunity.
So funding was integral to my thesis. All the data that I used was data I gathered from being in South Africa for 7 weeks. And so I applied for funding in spring of my junior year, and I got a substantial amount of money, so I was able to go to South Africa. And so it worked out well for me. And I'm not sure what kinds of questions there are about funding, if in terms of the application process, or if you should apply for funding, or like how to deal with funding. But I think that generally they're pretty generous. So if you are at all on the fence about whether you might require funding to do a part of your thesis, I'd say apply. Worst that happens, you decide you don't need it, you withdraw your application. Not a big deal. So, but if you think you might need funding, I would say go for it. And I think that everybody I knew that needed to go somewhere to get funding was able to go somewhere. A mutual friend of ours, did her thesis on the Disney parks. She was a comp lit major, and she got funding to go to every Disney park in the world. So you can get funding to do a lot of really cool things. So as long as you can connect it to what your research question is and have a coherent plan for why you need to go there and what the money is that is required, and as long as it's not like $20,000, then I think you're okay. I think I got 5,000. I think I was on the upper end of how much money people got. So if you need $10,000 to do something, I'd say regroup and reconsider where you're trying to go and see if you actually need that much money, because you're probably not going to get that much money. I requested 5,700 and I got 4,900. So and then the office of the dean of the college, which generally gives the overflow money, that if you didn't get enough from your department and your certificate program and CBLI or whatever, anything that could tangentially be related to what you do, then they'll cover the difference. And they did not cover my difference. So I think they thought that I got enough and I should go anyway. So I did, and I was able to cut some corners and not spend that extra $700. So I think 5,000 is probably the upper limit. So I'd try to stay below that, but I think if you're asking for, I don't think you could possibly spend $5,000 during the school year. I spent that much going to halfway across the world for 7 weeks. So I think you should be okay, and you'll probably get what you need.
And this is a really good reason to get in touch with an advisor and start having conversations, because your advisor might also have ideas about how to sort of expand your experience through some funding, through opportunities to travel, whether it's during winter break or fall break. It's getting kind of a little bit late to apply, but certainly it's important to have that conversation with your advisor. We have a question about writing from Andrew. How did you plan out deadlines and due dates for chapters?
For me, it's like a very process. So we have deadlines for the whole 9 months or so. So I didn't really have to even set my own deadlines. They sort of do it for us. But I know that not every department is like that, so I'm sure it's something that people can talk about theirs.
The English department didn't give us a lot of deadlines to meet throughout the year. I think it was maybe 20 pages were due at the end of the first semester, and then that might have been the only deadline they gave us. So it was really up to you to talk to your advisor and plan ahead. And I think from your other classes, you know what kind of writer you are, or what writing process you take and how long it takes you to do things. So just don't be pressured to compare yourself to other people and be like, oh, this person has this much done. At this point, that means I have to. So just go at your own pace. And if you don't meet a goal that you set for yourself, also don't let that derail you. Be flexible with yourself and be understanding with your own expectations.
And I think that when you're trying to plan out your schedule, for me, the way that I planned it out is I wrote down what would be easiest to write to what would be hardest to write. So I started with my introduction. That was the easiest. And I said, okay, let's try to get that done by mid-November. If I can knock that out, then I'll feel so much better. And then let's try to get the methods done before winter break. Because methods, I know the methods. I know what I did. That's easy to write. And so I tried to get the methods and the intro done first, and then I felt like I had something great done. And then I struggled with R for like 5 months and didn't write for a very long time. And then once I was done struggling with R, I went and did my results section. And that was pretty easy because I had all these things that popped out of R, and all I had to do was put in a bunch of tables and some words and explain what was in the tables. And then the hardest thing that was left was the discussion. So that's what I spent spring break writing. My goal was to get everything but the discussion done before spring break, so when I had nothing but thesis to do, I could focus on the discussion. And I thought, you know, I can write a discussion in 9 days, and I was able to write a discussion in 9 days, and so it worked out. But I was very flexible with my deadlines leading up to that. I was sort of like, I want to knock out everything but the discussion before spring break, and that's the deadline I set in September, which left a lot of room for not being disappointed in myself for not meeting deadlines.
Yeah, I would add, just kind of to echo what everybody else has said, like, the thing about chapters is they're different for everyone and different for every department. So, and also, as Christy said, like, you all wrote JPs or something like a JP, and so you know what that relationship was with your advisor and how that kind of timetable worked for you. And so when I just spent a lot of first semester talking with my advisor and changing my mind between every single meeting with him. And similar to English, I had one deadline for the first chapter, and I ended up using like 0 of that. And it was just like a very scattered process. But the most important thing is to just keep writing and chapters will kind of form out of this is more for like literary people, but chapters will come out of what you've written, because inherently you're writing to find a conclusion, and that writing is going to evolve, and you're going to go back and revise and change a chapter and delete a chapter and redo. So don't think that everything you write is going to be it. So factor that in making your deadlines, right? So set an early deadline, write 80%, and then go back and edit throughout the next few months.
That's a great point. The writing program talks a lot about sort of pre-writing activities and writing in order to sort of get to your writing. That's something that they try to encourage people to do during the early fall boot camps, and so we just sort of plugged for fall boot camps. You can sign up for those in October and November, and there'll be a place and a time set aside for you to begin some of these early writing activities, outlining and drafting and taking notes and things like that. Greta kind of alluded to this, and so I thought I would ask you all, how did you come up with your research question? Kind of backtracking a little bit.
I think a lot of people know originally what they're, like, the general topic of what they're working on pretty early on, just because it's what they're interested in. But then the more difficult question is like finding an argument, and I didn't really find a clincher to my argument till pretty late, like spring semester, and it all evolved out of the process of like reading and writing. So, and a lot of how my thesis was shaped was because of a German class that I took second semester, and it kind of became something that just happened. It wasn't really like my own. That was like, this is very unhelpful for you all, but it was in the end like something that kind of emerged out of the process of just writing a whole bunch. And I changed my mind, like I said, a whole bunch of times after working with my advisor. In fact, I remember the first time I met with my advisor, I said I explained what I wanted to write about, which included like a whole book that I never actually wrote about at all in my thesis. And he was like, okay, this all sounds great. What exactly would you like me to do? And I was like, I don't know. But that kind of ended up being the way that we worked. He was just kind of a sounding board for what I would say. And you might think that this wasn't a very helpful relationship between advisor and student, but it actually ended up being wonderful. And the only way that you can actually produce something good is by like writing something and then deleting it. So I just encourage you all to just write, and don't be afraid of changing your topics.
My process was also a little personal in that the whole reason that I'm interested in conservation and conservation biology is because of my first grade teacher who was obsessed with penguins, and she taught me about penguins, and that sort of was my gateway drug into animals and conservation and biology. So I thought it'd be really, really cool and coming full circle if I could do my thesis on penguins, and also something about how people relate to wildlife. And then I remember that my uncle lived in South Africa for a little while, and there was this picture of him amongst penguins at my grandparents' house. And so I called him, and I was like, where are those penguins? And then he was like, Cape Town. And I was like, okay, I'm going to Cape Town to do my thesis. Now I just have to figure out a question. And I was able to figure out a way to integrate all of my interests around those penguins, which is how people relate to wildlife and how we can get people interested in conservation. And I worked at a zoo for a lot of high schools, so I was able to integrate my interest in captive wildlife as opposed to ecotourism experiences. And it all kind of culminated in this big question that I came up with. And I honestly don't remember how I came up with that question. I probably wrote down all of my interests, which was like penguins, zoos, people and wildlife, ecotourism, and then that sort of evolved into how do people respond to seeing animals in a zoo versus animals in captivity when those animals are penguins? And so I was able to integrate all my interests into that one question. Turned out to be a really hard question to answer, but that's okay. I tried.
Mine sort of like fell into my lap a little bit because I had been following, like about a year and a half ago was when American Airlines and US Airways announced they were going to merge. And I've been following that just because I was interested in airlines or whatever. But that wouldn't have like on its own necessarily motivated my thesis. But then in like the summer before senior year, the Department of Justice sued the airlines to stop the merger from happening, arguing that it was unfair and it would be like harmful to consumers, and so that just provided like a really good reason to try to write and like see if would it really actually increase fares a lot and be bad for people. So yeah, that just kind of worked out nicely.
And mine was also just compiling different interests that I had. So I always really liked Virginia Woolf's novels, and she was part of the reason why I became an English major. And then I took a class on Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster with the professor who ended up being my thesis advisor. So really I was taking that class that only had maybe 4 people in it, and this was my junior spring. And I just really enjoyed it and wanted to keep writing about Virginia Woolf and learning with this professor. So I asked her to be my thesis advisor, and it worked out. And that summer I was working in like healthcare advertising, pharmaceuticals. So I started getting more interested in like sickness, but not too detailed. Like sickness is an idea. So that's kind of how I tied it in to my thesis.
So since people are still early in the process, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the early stumbling blocks you encountered, what you were most worried about when you were where our current seniors are right now.
I was scared of R. Like deathly terrified, and I knew that I would have to use it, and I didn't want to, and so I was able to pinpoint the most stressful aspect of my thesis was going to be using R. So I just started playing around with R, and I went to some of I discovered the Data and Statistical Services Center, which is in Firestone. So if you're somebody who's going to have to be doing some stats research, they are incredible. And I made really, really good friends with Oscar, and Oscar and I hung out every afternoon for a very large chunk of my senior year.
I guess the biggest stumbling block that I encountered was just very like content oriented, as you guys have probably guessed. To clarify, my thesis research that I did was actually going to Switzerland and interviewing these scientists who were working on a project that was sending a space telescope into orbit to look for other planets in our galaxy that may potentially have life on them. And my question was like, how do I connect this with comparative literature, which is what department I'm in? And so for a long time I kind of struggled to find a really good way to mesh those things. But the good thing was that like over the course of just reading and reading and reading and trying to find small connections in between those two things, I was able to finally find something else that was actually larger than both of them, and then it connected them, which had to do with German philosophy, of course. And I guess looking back, the whole idea of the thesis is to like totally immerse yourself in it, and you are not going to have the answer at the beginning. So it's really intimidating because the only thing you'll ever hear about other theses is, I've written this much, or I'm going to write another I've written my 3rd chapter. And that's all you hear. But really, when you are working on your thesis, it's only like, I'm stuck, and I can't get past this next word. What really helped me, actually, in terms of tactics was handwriting, because it's really hard to be like in front of a blank page on Microsoft Word and like not be able to produce something that you think you're going to use. But if you're in front of a notebook, it's much easier to write nothing and just produce stuff. So that helped me.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Greta said about the handwriting thing. For me, what I was scared of when I first started was just how many pages I had to write, and also there's so many pages and you don't know where to start. So just getting a piece of paper and jotting down your ideas is really helpful. And I guess for your thesis, you don't have to start at the beginning. You don't feel like you have to start with your introduction. I wrote like what ended up being my 2nd chapter first, and so it doesn't really matter. Just write things, and that'll help you get through the initial fear of not knowing where to start and feeling like you're never going to get enough pages.
Yeah, for me, I would say that like have an outline of first assignments that the ORF department had us do was turn in an outline by like the end of September. And that outline looks nothing like what my final thesis looked like, but at the beginning I was just kind of like, okay, I have this outline and I don't really know where to start with it. And I was kind of too focused on sticking with what I had set up for myself, but ultimately, like, you should just start working on something and you'll make some sort of progress. Like, as long as you're working, you're making progress. So just like do something. Just make yourself work on it, and I think, you'll eventually get there.
So we have a question from Jacqueline that's been up here for a while, and I guess this one is going to be for Alex and Greta. How do you know where to apply for funding from, like from your major or certificate or other place? So I'll let you two take that and perhaps add something myself.
So the SAFE funding and the Student Activities Funding Engine, the SAFE tool, makes it really easy because the only opportunities that exist are on that website. So you can plug in your information, like I've said, I want to go overseas for the summer, and this is my department, and this is my certificate, and it'll pop up everything that it thinks could potentially be relevant. And then I read through those, and I was like, okay, Judaic Studies, that's unfortunately not going to relate to penguins, so I can't really apply for that one. I had never heard of CBLI, the Community-Based Learning Initiative, and it turns out that it was relevant to my thesis because I was working with organizations, like local organizations that were in the communities, the organizations conserving the penguins, and I was going to be producing results that would be helpful for their education initiatives. So I was able to apply for that one and justify my thesis for their grounds. So I applied to my certificate and my major, which you should always apply for, and then CBLI. And so I only applied for 3, and that was fine. And if it only makes sense to apply to your major, then apply to your major and the Office of the Dean of the College, which covers everything, and I think that will be okay as well.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Alex said about the SAFE funding engine. It made it super easy for me to apply for funding because you just plug in exactly what you're applying for, which is senior thesis funding and maybe your department or something like that, and it'll give you all the options that will be able to help you. And basically, I got funding to do something that was very much related to my certificate. That's, Search for Life on Other Planets from comparative literature. So you might even be surprised where that funding is coming from. Just kind of fool around with that tool and see what happens.
This is also a good conversation to have with your advisor, because sometimes there's funding in professional organizations that your thesis advisor might be affiliated with that's available to undergraduates to do senior thesis research. So another good reason to have a good conversation with your advisor early on. We've talked a little bit about resources, and I wonder if you might address what other resources you used besides statistical help in the early stages of writing your thesis, things like McGraw or the writing program, libraries, anything of that nature.
I used the Writing Center quite near the end of my thesis, and it was extremely transformative. And this happened to me, I should have known, because this happened to me at the end of writing my JP too, and it basically allowed me to just, again, soundboard my ideas. I had a working draft that I thought was okay, and I gave it to them, and I ended up rewriting a lot of my thesis, but it was much better and much easier to do after I went there. And of course, the Writing Center can help you at any stage, and there's also people there that you just would go to if you knew who they were, and it's just a way of connecting you to those people, grad students who've written exactly what you are doing right now, and they're encouraging but also helpful and aggressively helpful. Yeah.
My department had all kinds of required colloquiums and seminars and things, which at the time I was really annoyed by because I was like, oh, this is just another thing I have to do, and they're still making me take physics, and I have no time, and I'm never going to be able to write my thesis. And it was actually really helpful that I had to, for the environmental studies certificate, do a presentation on my thesis, within the first month or so of school, and I didn't know what I was going to present on because I had just started, but it was a really useful exercise to go through and try to explain my thesis to somebody at that stage. And it wasn't my whole thesis, clearly, because I still hadn't done any of the analysis at the end, but I was able to tell people why I was asking this question, why it was an important question, and what kinds of things I already knew, like what kinds of people went to see penguins in a zoo versus in the wild. And it just made me feel so much better that I was able to give some people some substantive information about my thesis, and it helped me focus my question even more because I was able to articulate the motivation behind it, which by definition then told me what kinds of questions I should be asking. And the senior thesis writing groups for my department were super helpful. I don't know if they do those anymore, though. I loved mine.
Yeah, the English department. Oops, sorry, Greta. The English department had a boot camp that I thought was very helpful to just go once a week, work for 2 hours with people in your department to talk about ideas or just silently work together. So I'd recommend going to those if you can.
I know my department had senior thesis writing things. I just didn't go to them, which is why I wasn't saying anything. But I'm sure they were helpful.
A few residential colleges also have senior thesis writing group dinners.
Talk to the grad students in your department, because I think that they really do want to be helpful. And there was a grad student that was running our senior thesis writing group who was, without her, I don't think I would have been able to finish my thesis. And it was just really great to bounce ideas off of her every Wednesday and to go in there and be like, this is what I'm thinking, but I'm not sure if it's a legitimate question. And they know a lot more about the field than you do, and they can help you refine your thoughts and in a way that might be less intimidating than talking to professors or your advisor. But that totally depends on your relationship with the grad students in your department and your relationship with your advisor. But I found it really, really nice to be able to talk to some grad students and just get their advice.
Also, the librarians in the in-person library that are associated with each department are also extremely willing to help.
I think we've lost Justine.
Our fearless leader is gone.
It's time to go rogue. Are there any other questions? We can go.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, you can put it on the Q&A sidebar.
So one of the things we can talk about is the IRB approval process, the Institutional Review Board. So if you're doing any research that involves people, you're going to have to talk to them, and my research was like that. So if that's something that you would like to talk about, please just put it in the question panel, and we can talk about that process. If that's totally not relevant to the people who are on this call, then we should not talk about that process. So definitely let us know if that's something that would be helpful. How about let's talk about what we would have done differently looking back.
Yeah, I'll start, I guess. I would have just tried to make myself keep working more, because the way, like I said already, my department had lots of deadlines throughout, and so basically the way I worked was that I wouldn't really do anything until the deadline was like a week away. Then I would work on it for a while, and then when you do that, then by the time it comes to work on it again, you kind of forgot where you were. I think it's easier to just try to just do a little bit of work every week, as hard as that can be, because you still have classes and stuff, and you want to have fun. But I think that's what I would have done differently. Not that it ended up really killing me in the end or anything, but that would have made it a little less stressful in the last month or so.
I guess what I would do differently, or not differently, but if I could write another thesis, not that I would, but is Greta talked about this because she applied for funding and went abroad. My thesis mostly was me in the library by myself reading books and writing. So if I could write another thesis, I would definitely apply for funding and go abroad or have a really unique experience that wouldn't be possible in any other opportunity, because it really is a cool experience when you think about what a thesis is.
Yeah, I agree with that. Someone just asked me recently if my thesis was like the thing that I was most proud of after completing Princeton, and I said yes, because even though I don't think that it was like the most organized piece of work that I ever did, and I was often like stressed out, like kind of hearing about how far ahead a lot of people were, and every time I would go to one of those like thesis writing workshops or boot camps that we would have, people would be asking questions that were like way more advanced than I was. I'd be like, oh man, I'm still like thinking about my argument and like thinking about what I should write in chapter 2, and everybody's finished chapter 3. But like once you're just in the library, you found a spot and you're focused on your work and you're like in that zone where you can't think about anything else and you're just thinking about your thesis and all the things are kind of coming into place. It's a really wonderful time, and I think that's the reason why we love it so much after it's over.
And I think the thing that I would change is that I think you need to recognize that this is a really personal experience, that you're doing this for you, and that's the only, and because you have to graduate, but think of it as doing it's just for you, and try not to compare your experience to your friends' experiences. That was really hard for me because I have a twin sister that I was talking to a lot, and my experience is very, very different from her experience. And so I think that everybody has a different and unique thesis experience, and there's good sides about it, and there's bad things about it, and it's not going to be all rainbows and unicorns and sunshine all the time, and that's okay. But it's all going to be a positive experience in the end, and the whole point is to learn from it. And if you're constantly comparing yourself to, well, my advisor doesn't look at this, and I never meet with my advisor, and I'm not as far as this person, and then it's just going to turn into a huge stress fest when it doesn't need to be that much of a stress fest. So just try to take a step back and see it as a learning experience, and it's something you will get through, and you will graduate, I promise. You will turn something in, and it really is not that big a deal, and you will be proud of it, and it will be done, and that's okay.
Yeah, as my thesis advisor said to me pretty near the end, he was just like, it's just a thesis, so just remember.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for participating and joining us tonight. Unfortunately, we lost video, but hopefully everybody can still hear me. And we hope it's a valuable experience for you, and we'll try to do this again later on in the year, perhaps around intersession. So thank you, Chad, thank you, Christy, thank you, Greta, and thank you, Alex, for your sage advice.